Okay, at the end of the last part of this tutorial, we had finished up this doorway. I did jump ahead and add something else, but I can go ahead and get rid of that real quick. So your model should look something like this, and I wanted you to add these two elements down here at the bottom. Okay, so we are going to go ahead and continue where we left off. I'm going to go ahead and make this full screen so we can have a memory of what this looks like, and maybe zoom this out. There we go. Okay. All right, so we've got our model. The steps we need to take today, we're going to look at the array tool to generate this, and we'll add the pyramid on top, and then we will do the cut-ins using the bool. All right, so let's go ahead and continue on. All right, so let's start with getting these posts on this railing. So we know that our radius, if we go to our railing, we can look and see that the pipe radius is 3 centimeters. So let's go ahead and create a cylinder. We are going to make that cylinder. We're going to click on the Object tab in the Attributes Manager. And let's make the radius of that cylinder 3, so it matches the railing. And then we will make the height not 200. It's going to be a lot shorter. Let's go ahead and make it 10 to start with. I have no idea what distance I put this above the disk. I just sort of eyeballed it, as we said. But I'm going to start with 10. And then I'm going to go ahead and switch views so that I can see the stuff in profile. So I'm going to pull down here, and I'm going to go ahead and move this object. Now, one of the things that you want to do, and it's an easy mistake to do, is when you're modeling things, and let's say in this case, we know we're going to make multiple copies of the cylinder. We're not going to be manually placing each one of these. That would be a total nightmare. But when we do that, we want to make sure that we keep the object centered on the y-axis, right? The x and z positions, if I go to coordinates, should be 0 for both of these, right? The y, we're going to move this up, but we can also just leave everything at 0 now, and then apply these things, put these in an array and make this happen. So the reason for this is because any offset we have in here could potentially impact the it gets kind of calculated in when the copies are made, if that makes sense. And so we don't want to do anything that would create some weird, strange behavior. So leaving everything at 0, 0, 0 when we start, and then going from there works really well. So I'm going to rename cylinder 3 because I have so many cylinders here. I'm going to rename this post. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use an object called the array. And if I click and hold on this icon here, you can see there's this array option. All of these green things are called generators, and what they do is they generate things. And the way generators work is that they typically take some other object as what we call a child in order to and then they will apply that generation to the child, or they'll use the child to generate whatever they're generating. So in our case, the way you make an object a child is, I'm going to go ahead and just zoom in real quick so we can see this. You're going to go ahead and you click on the post, and you click and you click on it, you drag it, and you drop it. And you'll see the different arrows. If it goes this way, that means it's going to be just putting it basically right where it is, right? If I pull this down, you'll see a drop down arrow, or you'll see the side arrow. The side arrow just moves it in the hierarchy, up or down. The down arrow makes it a child of whatever object you have put it there in. Now, with this hierarchical system, what that means is that, like, let's say I'm not doing this as a generator. I'm just let's say I want to make this post a child of this cylinder for some reason. What that means is now when I move this cylinder.2, it's going to move the post with it. and the post's position relative to the cylinder is going to stay the same. So if I had, so we can look at some examples later, but I just kind of want to get the sense that you can make anything a child of anything. So I'm going to go ahead and make this a child of the array. I'm going to zoom my screen back out, and you can already see we've got these extra little dots here. So let's go back to our perspective view. And I'm going to zoom out, and you can see those little tiny cylinders, right, are now all dispersed in a circle around this tower. Now, obviously, there's some settings that need to be adjusted. So let's go ahead and click on our array. Now, you'll notice something else is that if the child is selected, anything that's bright orange is what's selected. The dull orange means that one of the, say, children of the object is selected. So it just lets you know it's like lightly selected. But so I want to select the array. And then I want to come down to the Attributes Manager, click on the Object tab, and you'll see I have radius, copies, amplitude frequency, and array frequency, and some other things. The ones we're going to focus on today are radius and copies, but we'll look at what the other parts do really quick. So let's go ahead and set the number of copies up. Notice that if you were to count this out, or even just look at it, you can tell that even though this copy is hidden, there's actually 8 copies, right? And so the copies is one less than the total number. It includes for whatever reason, they include the original object as one of the things, and then they copy it 7 more times, or so, right? So instead of saying, like, if we wanted 32, we'd instead put in 31. Right, so let's go ahead and do that. So now we've got a bunch more copies. And this will show us what amplitude and frequency and all of that does. So if I crank up the amplitude, you'll see that the array, for whatever reason, it basically makes like you can create like I don't know, a wave of things. It's sort of like a sine wave or something. You can increase or decrease your frequency. I don't know if I make this 100, what that... Right, it's not really doing anything with this number of copies. I'm going to set that back to 0. If I do the array frequency, though, you'll see that that can make some changes. And what's nice about this is, right, these are things that you can animate if you get to the animation point in here. And so you can kind of see that you get some changes in there. But it's not something that I've ever honestly used. I've never used those features for anything in any model. There's other ways to do stuff that give you a lot more freedom. And so we need 31 copies, and let's go ahead and take our radius down. I don't know exactly what it is. We can look, but we're just going to go ahead and say 143 to get us close. And then making sure we still have the array selected, let's go ahead and lift this up. But it's probably best to go into our front or side view. I'm going to hit H so that this is all framed. And I'm going to go ahead and drag this up. And then we are going to go ahead, and I think you probably already had I think I deleted the pyramid prematurely, but that's okay. But you can see that this radius is a little bit too big still. So I'm going to start by looking at the radius of the deck. The radius of the deck is 139.63. Let's look at the radius of the railing, because I'm not sure if this is going to be centered or not. So it's 136 something. I'm going to go ahead and copy this one. I'm going to select it and copy it. And then I'm going to go back to the array, and I'm going to go ahead and paste this in as my thing and hit enter or return. And then if we zoom in a little bit, we can see that this is probably a little bit too far out. And we might actually want these railings to be just a little bit smaller, or sorry, the posts to be a little smaller than the railings. But to check how everything aligns, let's first select our post, and let's increase the height, right? Because you can see here that the height, there's a gap between both sides. So I'm going to go ahead and increase this. And what I want these to intersect, and it's kind of jumpy when I was doing it that way, because it's choosing to do it centimeter by centimeter, which is fine. Okay, so I've got this set. I do want to lift the position of the array up, I want you to note if I have the post selected and I try and raise the post, right? It's raising, but those copies are not moving. And that's because the array basically ignores every positional thing you do to the child object, right? It sort of locks that once you've created it. And so that means that I can't lift this thing up this way. I can still adjust the width and height. I could probably actually adjust the height this way, right, if I wanted to, and the width as well, but I can't do any positional changes. So I need to select the array and then move the array up itself. The reason they do this is it just makes it a little bit less chaotic, because if you're like moving the position of the array a little bit and then you move the position of the piece, but the array stays the same, it just gets really, really confusing. And there's other times when that still happens, but not with this object. They've really kind of locked it down. Okay, so let's see, we go over here. And if I zoom in a little bit, we can see that that actually looks pretty good. I might want to make the diameter of these just a little bit smaller so they fit more uniformly. So I'm going to go ahead and go to my post, and currently the radius is 3. I'm going to make it, let's just make it 2.5 and see what that looks like. I think that looks actually pretty fantastic. I am going to make sure that everything is at 0. So I'm going to select here, go to coordinates, and I just want to make sure X and Z are 0 there, and X and Z and Y are 0 there. Perfect. Okay. So we've got our railing. Now, if we go back to the image, you'll see that there's actually the word Planet Express in there. We're going to cover how to use like text objects and how to wrap things and make them have curvature like that, but not in this tutorial. It's a little bit more advanced, and I don't want to get into that quite yet. All right, so let's go ahead and start working. Look at how to use bools. Okay, so we need to cut out of this object, right? And what we need to do is we need to cut, I don't know how many, it's like 10 or 11 or something. Chunks need to be cut out of the surface of this cone. And so the way that you cut things using primitives in Cinema4D is by using something called a bool. It's another generator. And what we're going to do right now is I'm going to create a new file so I can show you what this is. You don't have to do this, but I just want to be able to show you clearly what's going on before we get in the woods with this thing. So you can either hit Command or Control N to create a new file. And note my Planet Express file is here, and then I also have this new one that's here. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a cube and a cylinder. And I'm going to have the cylinder, I'm just going to make the cylinder taller so that it passes through the center of the cube. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to my generators, and under the generators there is this one here. It's called Bool. I'm going to go ahead and create that. Now once I've done that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select these two objects, and you can click and drag to select multiple objects. You could also click on one, hold shift, select the other one. Both of those things work fine. There's no difference in what they do. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to click and drag these until that arrow points down when I'm hovering over Bool. And when I do that, you'll see my cube disappears and my cylinder appears to be truncated, right? It's missing the part with the cube. So what's going on? Let's look at our Bool and see what's happening. So if I go to the Bool and I go to the object attributes, and I zoom in just a little bit to make your life easier, you'll see the Boolean type is A subtract B. It's high quality, and there's a bunch of other settings here. So what that means, what A subtract B means, is that if we go to our hierarchy here, the first object, the first child, you can see there's these little paths that say these are children of the bool. And note there's a little minus symbol here. If I click on this square, it'll hide everything, but it'll tell me there's more stuff under there by showing that plus. All right. So this is just nice because you can collapse things, and it makes when you have a bunch of objects in here, it makes your life a lot easier. So what it's saying is it's object A is subtracting B, right? So we're essentially, A is our primary object, which is, right, the cylinder, and B is the cube, which is being subtracted from the cylinder. If I was to select the cube and drag this up until it turns into that drop-down arrow, it will reverse that order, and so now the cube is the A object and the cylinder is being subtracted from it. All right, so now there's a hole right through the middle of this cube. Now, you can only do bools with two objects, right? So it has to be two separate objects. You can't have 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever. But what we need to do, and it would be a nightmare if we were to go back to our other file, if we had what we're going to be doing is we're going to be removing a cube from the side of this, but then we'd have to create some crazy chain of things to get all of them out of there. However, you can, if objects are in a group or a null, or say they're children of an array, then Cinema4D treats them as a single object. So let's say we go back to this test example that I'm doing here, and I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this cylinder, and I'm going to just come down to the object pane here, and I'm going to switch the orientation to X+. All right, so we'll have one going up and one going sideways. Now, if I bring this down and make it a child of this, you'll see that, right, what it's done is, because I made this the second child, it's cut that hole, but this other one still is basically just there. It's not impacting anything. So I'm going to go ahead and see what happens if I make a null. A null is this object up here, and it's basically, you can think of it as a group or a container, like a folder for other objects. And so I'm going to go ahead and create a null, and then I'm going to take my two cylinders, and I'm going to make them children of that null. And then I'm going to take the null, and I'm going to make it the second child of the bool. Now, sometimes when you dragging and dropping into a bool is sometimes obnoxious and it doesn't go the way you want it to. So if this didn't change, and you'll see that there's some weirdness here. You can see there's cutaways, but then not cutaways, like the edges of the cylinders are still in there, which is kind of cool, but not what we really want. Right, and so this kind of shows some of the limitations of the bool. But if we were to have these two things next to each other and not intersecting, then we'd have a much better operation that's happening. And I'll show you how to kind of fix that in a second. Sometimes you may try and drop this as a second child and it actually spits out here. I found that sometimes it's just easier to, you can see how that worked. Sometimes it's just easier to just drag it and rearrange the order that way, because it can be finicky when you're trying to stick them next to each other. So this null, right, is working in the sense that I can now have two objects that are impacting this. But as I said, right, we're having some issues in there. It doesn't quite know what to do with what I'm telling it to do. So what I'm going to do, instead of just using this null, I could, if this was a different operation, right? If I just wanted two objects, I can scoot this one over, right? And then if I have this hole here, and then I've also should now have a pass-through hole here, right? But there's still where those intersections are happening, I still have that geometry that shows up. And that's just something that the bool does. It's the way it works, and it's not perfect. So what we can do instead of using a null with these two cylinders is I can create a second bool. So if I go here and I go to bool, right, a bool is going to work just like a group, except it's a group that does fun things. So if I select these two cylinders and I pull them into this bool number 1, you'll see that, right, one has disappeared, one is sticking through the sides, and basically there's nothing going on with this cube at all. Right? If I uncheck this, by the way, these are the visibility checks. If I close those, it hides it, and you'll see what's happening here. Right? There's like that one cylinder is chopping through the middle of that thing. So what we want to do, though, is what would be nice is if we could unite these two cylinders into one object. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, click on the bool that we're using for our two cylinders, and where it says Boolean type here under the object settings, we can change this from A union subtract B to A union B, right? So now these are one object and a plus sign symbol. We can also say A intersect B, so it's just that little nubbin, or A without B. The difference between A subtract B and A without B, A subtract B fills in any holes that are made. A without B is basically just the skin and leaves a hole in the surface, right? So I can actually see inside my cylinder now. And there's certain times when you need to do that. The vast majority of the time you're going to be using one of the top three. So we're going to say A union B. And then what we're going to do is we'll delete this null because we don't need it anymore. And we're going to drag this bool down and we're going to make it a child B, of this other bool. And you'll note that, like, right now I don't see anything happening, and that's because I unchecked these objects. So if I check mark all of those things and I've got these two united in one bool, then now you can see that this is actually cutting out the entire cross, right? Which is pretty cool, right? It means you can make reasonably complex geometry out of very, very simple shapes without a whole lot of time or effort. Now, one thing to note is that if you have like deep chains of bools, they really start to make things lag because they're generators. They're doing a lot of math to do the things they do. And so it's something where it's great. You want to be working with this for a while. And then we'll talk later about how to make things editable, which just basically means you sort of set these settings permanently when you're happy with them. And that makes things go a lot smoother. Okay, so we're going to go back to our Planet Express model. And we are going to go ahead and create a cube. And let's go ahead and, again, we're just trying to figure out the best way to do this. I'm going to go ahead and scale this thing down, and it's going to be in the center of my model right now. And this might be a good time to show solo mode. So if I come up here to this top bar and I click on this little icon here, what that does is it hides everything except what I have selected. Yeah, so if I turn both of these on and I have this set to view, port solo, automatic, and all of that, if I turn all of that on, then it works the way that the old solo used to work. So in this case, right, I have this set to solo because I don't want to move the position of this, but I want to be able to see it well enough to get it reasonably close. And I'm going to make it pretty tall. And by pretty tall, I mean, let's say 256 units more or less, because I want it to be a little taller than the than what we're going to be cutting it out from, the base. But I don't want it to be too much taller than that. Okay, so let's go ahead and turn solo mode off, and we can just turn all of that off right now. Okay. So we've got this one. We know what we need to do is we need to put it in an array so we can create multiple copies. However, we also know that I can't rotate it or do any positional changes to it if it's in the array. So how do I fix that? Let's go ahead and create the array and make it a child of the array to start with. Right, so I'm going to say, okay, here's my cube. It's in an array. Okay, so one, it's oriented incorrectly. Right, I want it to be the narrow way towards it. And two, I'd like to be able to rotate these in so they match this angle. But if I was to go to my cube, and let's say I hit the letter R on the keyboard to do rotation, right, I can rotate this object all I want, but it's not going to move the clones at all. And the same goes for position, and so that's not going to work. So what I need to do is I need a way to free up the motion of this while still having it in the array. And that's one of the ways that null is super useful. Because what this does is the array just locks the position of the null, but does not lock the position or rotation or scale or anything of the child of the null. So I'm going to create a null. I'm going to take this cube, make it a child, and I'm going to make the null a child of this array. Now, if I select my cube and I say, okay, let's rotate this 90 degrees, right? So I'm going to click. You can see now they're all rotating. So I'm going to go ahead and go to 90. And I held down shift so it would snap in 5-degree increments. You could also like get it close, like say it's right there. And if I go to coordinates, I can look up here and I can say, oh, this is at 78. For some reason, these are also off a little bit. That's probably because I touched it or did something weird there. But if I just make this 90 and then make this 0 and make this 0, okay, you'll see everything is looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and make the radius of our array smaller so it actually fits to the object we're going to be doing. So I'm going to go to the object pane on my array, and I'm going to go ahead and pull this radius down. And I think we need, I don't know how many copies there are of that thing. We're going to go ahead and leave it set at 7. And then, yeah. So, okay, so let's go ahead and now let's move the position of the array up. So I'm going to hit the letter E for the move tool, or I can click over here. I'm going to drag this up. And then now, right, I'm going to rotate this view. And I'm going to go ahead and start to rotate my cubes. So if I use the letter R on the keyboard, or I click on this button here, I can rotate, and I'm going to rotate my view here a touch so I can actually see these things rotating in. Right, that's the wrong direction, but you can see how they're all rotating together. It is on the blue axis. And then now I'm going to go ahead and go a little bit further in there. If I go to say the side view here and hit H, I might have a little bit better, clearer understanding of what's going on, but most likely not. This is something where there's probably a better way to actually align this to the edge of the cone, but we're going to just, again, do it this freehand way for now. It looks like it's reasonably close to where I want it to be. So I'm going to go back to perspective. I could turn the visibility off on some of this other stuff. Specifically, the globe is kind of in the way, and probably the deck and the railing. So I'm going to turn those off too. I'm going to rotate this. And so, yeah, you can see how this is, right, cutting in. It looks honestly pretty good there. I might need to make some changes. So now what we need to do is we need to bool this, the base with this array. But instead of booling it with just the base, right, we actually need to have the footer in there too, because that gets cut out as well. So let's go ahead and create a null. And then we will make the base footer and the base cone, which are my first two objects in my hierarchy, children of that null. So they appear to Cinema4D to be a single object. This actually, sorry, undo that. Let's make remember what happened the last time we used a null and they did weird intersecting things? Let's use a bool instead, right? And we're going to do it in union mode. So we're going to say bool, base footer, base cone, select those two, make them children. You'll see that that disappears some things. I'm going to now say A union B in the object tab. So they're one object. And then now that I've got this array, and we're going to call this cutouts, just because that makes life easier. So we say cutouts, and then this bool, we'll just leave as bool for now. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create one more bool. And so we're going to say, and then we will make this, we want this is the order we want them in. We want this to be A and the cutouts to be B, right? That's what we're subtracting. So we're going to hold Shift, select both of those, click and drag and drop. And right now they totally disappeared entirely. So what that means is we probably need to select our array and make this radius smaller. And you can see as I start to go in here, it's starting to cut into that. And you'll note there's something else down here, and I saw this. I must have created a disk on accident and never got rid of it. If you have this in your model, get it out of there. If not, don't worry about it, but there we go. Okay, so now you can see that we've got these cutouts happening, and they're maybe a little wide. It looks, oddly, they look wider at the top than they do at the bottom. Although they're not, I think that's just a perspective thing from the view I had with my camera, right? It's always good to rotate around because sometimes something looks really funky, but it's not. It's just the way the lighting and stuff works on the model. Okay, so we've got these things cut in here. So something to note with this is, right, we can always add more copies. So if I go to my cutouts array, right, I could say, oh, maybe that's actually 9 copies. But when I do that, really strange things start to happen. So what the heck is going on when I did that? What's going on is if I turn this bool off, what you'll see is that these different copies are intersecting with one another, right? And when those different copies intersect with one another, Cinema4D doesn't know what the heck to do when you're asking it to bool, because it's like, okay, well, we're going to cut these out and do this and do that, and then it freaks out because this intersection is happening. So if you ever bool something and you have a bunch of, right, and you have like an array or a cloner that you're booling from something else, and suddenly everything disappears or does really weird stuff, that's because your clones or the copies of the object that you're cutting away from the other object are intersecting with one another, and Cinema doesn't know what the heck you want it to do. So in this case, I'm going to take my cube and I'm going to use the settings here, and I'm going to go ahead and see which I can slide X down a little bit, but Z in my case is the one that really needs to be thinned out. So if I thin this out a little bit more, turn my bool back on, now I just have more copies, right? You'll see I still have a little bit of an issue here where there's some cutting in going on. And so maybe I just need to make my radius on this just a little bit bigger. So I'm going to say, let's say 92. There we go, right? You can see that by adjusting that just a hair, I have made it so that this is now more effective. There's one that is still not cutting correctly. The question is, why is that one hanging out over there, not doing the right thing? So maybe I should say 93 or 93 centimeters. Okay, so 93 centimeters seems to have eliminated more problems, but I'm still having one where this isn't cutting away like it's supposed to. So I'm going to go to my cube, and I might make my X size back to 50 to see if that fixes it. Okay, so I'm continuing to tweak this just a little bit. And a couple of the things that are happening is that, right, I just have this weird thing where like one copy isn't doing what I want it to do. There's a couple things I can do to try and fix that. First, I can continue to tweak the radius until it's happy. I can also attempt to tweak the size of Z and X and Y. And 256, right, it's taller than it needs to be. So let's go ahead and make this 220. So already, right, that setting that to 220 solved all those issues, right? Because what was happening is up here somewhere, those objects were still, there was still some little like one tiny corner of intersection or something happening. And so, but 220, it's also a little bit too short because it's leaving this foot here. I kind of like that, but I'm trying to do this so it looks right for, you know, for everybody. So let's do 225. And then that's getting a little bit closer and we're not having any issues. Let's do 226. We still have a little bit left. So we're doing 226. Let's go ahead and do 227. Oops. Try that again. Okay, 228. Right, and I'm just going to keep stepping up by 1 centimeter because that's right exactly what I didn't want to have happen, is that this would go the way it went. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to see if I go and select my cube. And what I'd like to do is use the move tool to move this just down along the y-axis just a touch and see what happens. Look at that. If I just move it, I moved it like a hair and it worked. All right, so this is something to note if you're using this tool to do an arrayed cutout. Sometimes you have to make a lot of little tweaks and you just have to think, where is it possibly intersecting that's causing the problem? And you just keep tweaking, start making things smaller. Sometimes it's good to like go much smaller and be like, okay, this all works. And then slowly scale up until you break it. And then, right, you can either move the position of the objects a little bit. Sometimes it's actually the degrees of rotation you might need to adjust. It really depends on what you're working on. But it's always like, if you're getting that weird stuff, something's intersecting and you need to figure out what it is and try and fix it. Okay, so that's where we're going to stop this section. Let's go ahead and turn everything back on, though, so we can see our model. Awesome. It's starting to really look a lot like that tower. Okay.